On the 26th of September 2018, an orange seaplane flew toward a remote island. Inside the aircraft were two sealed metal crates containing two of the 19 gray wolves being brought to the island. They were transported to two different locations. At the first site, ecologist Lynette Potvin personally unlatched the crate holding the female wolf. But contrary to everyone's expectations, the wolf did not rush out. Instead, she remained curled up inside. Just a few steps away, 132,000 acres of wilderness would be hers to roam. Only after the sound of the plane's engine faded into the distance did Lynette Potvin finally watch her disappear into the brush. The second wolf, a male, also waited until nightfall before leaving his crate. But something even more remarkable happened afterward, when footage from a camera hidden in an oak tree was finally revealed. People erupted with excitement over a secret scientists had been waiting nearly a century to uncover. How could just 19 wolves solve 3 ecological problems on Isle Royale at the same time? Isle Royale sits isolated in the middle of Lake Superior and can only be reached by boat or plane. Yet more than 80 years ago, the island welcomed some very unusual visitors. When winters grew cold enough, the lake froze and formed an ice bridge connecting the island to Canada, allowing the first gray wolves to cross over in 1948. But moose had arrived the same way nearly half a century earlier, and their population had grown rapidly. So when the wolves finally reached the island, they found themselves surrounded by prey. 2 unfamiliar species had entered an island with its own unique ecosystem, setting off a series of ecological disasters in the decades that followed. This is what led ecologist Durward Allen to launch the Wolf Moose Project. He originally planned for it to last just 10 years, but the study continues to this day, making it the longest-running predator-prey study in the world. And all that time was far from wasted. Allen discovered a clear cycle. When moose numbers rose, wolf numbers followed. But when too many wolves caused the moose population to decline, the wolf population eventually fell as well. Everything began to change in 1980. From around 50 wolves, the population quickly dropped to just 12, 14. At first, scientists believed canine parvovirus, brought to the island by visitors' domestic dogs, was the main cause. But even after the outbreak passed, wolf numbers continued to decline. Eventually, scientists discovered that inbreeding was the real threat. Cut off from other populations, the wolves were forced to mate with close relatives, causing their genetic diversity to steadily deteriorate. To understand just how serious the inbreeding problem had become, look at what happened in 1997, when nature briefly came to Isle Royale's rescue. A male wolf crossed the ice from Canada, bringing fresh genes with him. He reproduced so successfully that by 2008, more than half of the island's wolves carried his bloodline. But then the same cycle began again. His descendants continued breeding with one another. By 2018, only 2 wolves remained on Isle Royale, and they were a father and his daughter. At this point, it is clear that the 19 wolves brought new genetic diversity to the island. But that was not what the cameras hidden in the oak trees had captured. These wolves had triggered a much bigger change across the entire island. But we'll come back to that later. But before that, think back for a moment. If the wolves disappeared, who would benefit the most? Clearly, the moose. As predation pressure dropped sharply, the moose population began growing at an alarming rate. By 2019, researchers estimated that Isle Royale was home to about 2,060 moose. That may not sound like a huge number, but remember, this is an island of just over 200 square miles, with a strictly limited supply of winter food. When thousands of moose searched for food during the snowy season, balsam fir, their most important winter food source, was quickly overbrowsed. And they did not just eat older branches. They especially favored the top shoots and young trees, which are the future generation of the forest. Between 2019 and 2021, in the study areas, more than 80% of young balsam fir within reach of moose were browsed. The forest did not die immediately. Mature trees were still standing, so from a distance the forest appeared completely normal. But beneath the canopy, young trees were repeatedly stripped by moose, preventing them from ever reaching maturity. We all understand that bringing wolves back could solve 3 problems at once: restore genetic diversity, control the moose population, and protect the future of the forest. But bringing wolves back was not nearly that simple. For many people, wolves carried a deeply rooted reputation as dangerous animals, especially when introduced into an ecosystem, so they opposed the idea. The debate quickly divided conservationists into two opposing camps. One side argued that Isle Royale was one of the rare wilderness areas where humans should stay out. If the wolves disappeared, nature should be allowed to write the next chapter on its own. Intervening would undermine the value of a natural experiment that had been unfolding for decades. The other side responded with a much harder question. If a warming climate was making ice bridges across Lake Superior increasingly rare, preventing new wolves from reaching the island on their own, could doing nothing still truly be considered letting nature decide? Beginning in 2015, the National Park Service launched a multi-year review process. Then, on the 7th of June 2018, Cam Shawley signed the final decision. Humans would intervene. The plan allowed approximately 20 to 30 wolves to be brought to Isle Royale. From that moment on, the debate was settled on paper, but a much larger experiment in the wild was only just beginning. From the fall of 2018 through September 2019, a total of 19 wild wolves were selected from several populations around the Great Lakes region to avoid repeating the disaster of inbreeding. 4 from the Grand Portage Indian Reservation in Minnesota, 11 from Ontario, and 4 from Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The project was estimated to cost about $2 million. Each relocation was almost like a small military operation. The wolves were captured in the wild, sedated, weighed, sampled, screened for disease, vaccinated, and fitted with GPS collars before being placed into transport crates. Small aircraft then carried them across Lake Superior, where veterinary teams performed one final check before each crate was opened in the forest. In Ontario alone, capturing the wolves required aircraft, flights through winter storms, a polar vortex, and extremely narrow weather windows that were safe enough for takeoff. Behind those 19 animals was an entire network that included the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Minnesota and Michigan Departments of Natural Resources, USDA Wildlife Services, the Grand Portage Band, the Ontario Ministry, and research teams. But opening the crates turned out to be the easiest part. Almost immediately afterward, the project began facing events that no one could control. Survival was far from easy for them in those first few years. In just 2 years, 8 wolves died. Most notably, 4 were killed by other wolves during territorial conflicts. Others died from pneumonia, infections, or causes that could not be determined. Even F3, a female wolf that humans had gone to great lengths to bring to the island, found her own way off. On the 31st of January 2019, Lake Superior froze over, creating a natural ice bridge. F3 stepped onto the ice and headed back toward the mainland, close to the area where she had originally been captured. What researchers had been waiting for finally began to happen. Wolves that had been brought in from different places started finding mates, competing for territory, establishing hierarchies, and forming new packs. GPS collars showed that their initially chaotic movements gradually turned into clear boundaries on the map. From a collection of unfamiliar individuals, they were beginning to become a real population. Then, within the very first year, researchers began documenting wolf pairs forming. By the second winter, GPS signals showed invisible boundaries emerging between different hunting territories. By the winter of 2026, Isle Royale had around 37 wolves, divided into at least 3 major packs. The West Pack with 13 or more wolves, the East Pack with about 12, and the Northeast Pack with around 12. Even more remarkably, at least 9 pups from the previous breeding season had survived to the winter survey. Remember, just a decade earlier, only 2 closely related wolves remained on the entire island. From those 2 wolves, humans brought in 19 more, and now they had reproduced on their own to create a population of roughly 37 animals. But the greatest success was not the number of wolves, it was what began happening to the moose population. In 2019, Isle Royale had around 2,060 moose. By the winter of 2026, only 524 remained, a decline of as much as 75%. Moose density had fallen to just about 0.98 animals per square kilometer, and predation pressure had become far more intense. Researchers estimated that in 2026, wolves could kill the equivalent of roughly 24% of the entire moose population each year, compared with a historical average of only about 9.9%. During just 41 days of the winter survey, they documented around 28 moose killed by wolves. Those numbers show that the wolves had not simply returned, they were hunting moose extremely effectively. Camera traps mounted on oak trees revealed another part of the story. In one piece of footage released by Isle Royale National Park, a moose left a trail, and just a few minutes later, 3 wolves ran along that exact same route. It offered a clear glimpse of how the landscape of fear was returning. Moose that once could stand in one area for long periods browsing vegetation now had to keep watching, moving, and avoiding places where wolves had been active. They did not need to witness a hunt to know danger was nearby. The scent of a wolf, its tracks, or even the sight of one was often enough to make them leave the area. From an island that once held more than 2,000 moose facing almost no meaningful predation pressure, Isle Royale had now been divided into territories patrolled and hunted by wolf packs every day. And when moose could no longer remain in one place for hours, stripping young trees bare, an even greater change began to appear in the forest itself. But the wolves' impact did not stop at reducing the moose population. Offshoots on young balsam fir trees in the study areas were eaten. But then the balance shifted. Bite marks on young trees also began disappearing rapidly. By the summer of 2000, the young trees had finally escaped the mouths of the moose. They would grow taller. But when researchers returned to measure the young balsam fir trees, they found that the forest was not responding. The offshoots bitten off by moose winter after winter. The trees did not die immediately, but wolves increase, moose decline, forest turns green again. There is also one thing scientists on Isle Royale are especially careful about: turning a series of. Even so, the project is still considered a success. But by the summer of 2026, as the wolf population had recovered strongly, some individuals began showing up far too close to people. At 3 Mile Campground, one wolf repeatedly wandered around the campsite, sniffing and scratching at tents, dragging backpacks away, and even crawling inside one tent. It was becoming less afraid of people and was starting to associate the campground with food. On July 9, the National Park Service was forced to close the tent sites and group camping area there through the end of the month. Park rangers could not simply capture the wolf and move it somewhere else. Instead, they had to try to teach it to fear people again, yelling, stomping their feet, clapping, using air horns, and even firing paintballs to drive it away from the campground. At the same time, the NPS tightened garbage management and food storage rules. From 2025 to 2026, food lockers were also installed at campgrounds to reduce opportunities for wildlife to get access to visitors' food. And 3 Mile was not the only case. Just a few days later, Duncan Narrows Campground had to be closed for the second time that July. One or more wolves had scratched, torn, and pushed through the screen of a shelter, dragged clothing and other belongings outside, and chewed on a cooler that had not been stored properly. Fortunately, no visitors were inside at the time. In 2018, the question was, how do you bring wolves back to Isle Royale? By 2026, the new question had become, how do you keep them wild enough to stay away from people? This is not evidence that the project failed. On the contrary, it reveals a more complicated truth. When humans successfully restore a predator, ecosystem management does not end. They simply move on to a new challenge. Right now, Isle Royale has reached a point where even researchers who have studied the island for decades may not be able to say with certainty what will happen next. The wolf population has grown to around 37, close to its historic high. Meanwhile, the moose population has fallen to about 524, approaching some of the lowest levels ever recorded. Browsing pressure has dropped sharply, but the balsam fir forest is still recovering far more slowly than expected. So the story of the 19 wolves is not over yet. If moose numbers continue to fall, will the island's 3 wolf packs still have enough food to maintain their current size? As prey becomes scarce, will wolf numbers begin to decline as well, giving the moose a chance to recover once again? And more importantly, how long will a forest that has endured decades of browsing need to truly recover? 5 years, 10 years, or even several decades? No one knows for sure. And that is exactly what makes Isle Royale so special. After nearly 70 years of research, the island continues to prove that nature does not operate like a machine that can be fixed simply by putting one gear back in place. Bringing wolves back changed the moose population, changed the pressure on vegetation, and triggered a series of other reactions. But restoring an ecosystem is not the same as turning back the clock. Every change creates a new chapter, along with new problems that humans must once again learn to adapt to. So what do you think will happen next on Isle Royale? Will wolf numbers fall first? Will the moose recover? Or will the forest make all of us wait another decade? Leave your prediction in the comments. If you enjoy true stories about how animals can transform an entire ecosystem, subscribe to the channel. And in the next video, we'll travel to another place where humans also brought an animal back in hopes of saving nature, but the result was even more surprising than what happened on Isle Royale.